Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and good morning. So great to be with our friends here who are in room 24 and 25, and so great to be with our friends who are on live stream. We are just so overflowing with gratitude this Shabbat weekend before Thanksgiving because we're so thankful to have a really special guest speaker, Rick Stone, who is here, and his wife, Elizabeth Cohn. Welcome, welcome. We want to thank Rick and Elizabeth for being here this weekend. Want to thank Steve Broder, who is our member who really came up with this beautiful idea and made it happen. And want to thank a dear colleague, Terry Swartz Russell, who is really the director of all of the adult learning in our community. She's been doing this job so excellently and professionally and thoroughly and capably for 20 years. And she is retiring from Temple Emmanuel at the end of December. So Rick's teaching this weekend is essentially her swan song, and we're just really grateful to Terry and to Steve and to Rick. So before we do our blessings to thank God for the gift of learning Torah together, I wanted to kind of just frame that we brought Rick in because he's going to help us tackle one of the greatest challenges, I think, in the world and in our life and in the Talmud. Here it is. Can you be deeply Zen with the bad stuff in your life? Right? Of course, it's easy to be deeply grateful for the good stuff in your life. But is there some way you can get to a place of deep Zen about the problems that are deep, painful, and unresolved? And if you go to sleep worrying about something, and if you wake up worrying about something, and if you do that month after month and year after year, just unresolved pain, can you get to a place of deep Zen? Like truly deep centering, grounding, anchoring. I'm actually really good with that deep pain. So here is the command from the Talmud. Chayav Adam levarech al hara'ah. A person is obligated to bless God for the bad. Kashem, just as, kashem, shemavarech al hatovah, just as we will bless God for the good. Chayav, a person is obligated to bless God for the bad, just as a person is obligated to bless God for the good. And the question is that possible? It feels hard, it feels counter to human nature. But if you could actually get to that kind of a deep Zen, what would your life look like? And here's what Rick Stone has brought us. He and his colleague Scott Livengood are the author of a book, Story Intelligence, Master Story, Master Life. And the claim is that story is a genre of truth that is just different from other genres of truth. And that if you were to be in a classroom with chalk and a chalkboard and theorems and postulates, you might not be able to get there. But perhaps story truth can help us get where other kinds of truths can't get. That's his book, that's his teaching. He is our Maggid in residence. So let's thank God for the gift of learning Torah together, and then we will turn it over to Rick Stone. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. V'harevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu u'b'fi amcha be'Yisrael. ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בישראל, כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה, ברוך אתה אדוני המלמד תורה לעמו ישראל, ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים, ונתן לנו את תורתו, ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה. So, Rick, the format here is that you'll be with us, the clergy team, till about 9:35 or so, 9:05 or so, 9:05, 9:10, and then you'll have about 20, 25 minutes with members of our congregation. It's all yours. Thank you.
Well, things change, and I was going to do something different, but as you're introducing this, I began thinking that I'm going to start at a different story than I thought I would start with this morning.
Great.
Let's start with more of a Zen story. and then work our way into an Hasidic story, which I think really addresses this passage you just read in the Talmud. So this is one of my favorite stories, and it has continued to resonate for me for years, and I use it in my teaching continually, and it has become a philosophical sort of anchor for me as I face difficult things when things are not going well. So it's called The Remarkable Horse. It's a Chinese story. When I told the story to Steve, he said, "Oh, it sounds very Jewish." So maybe it's Jewish too. So there's an old man, and he has a son. His wife had died many years before. They're very poor. They live in a little village. And one day, they see a remarkable horse come riding into the paddock. And the father says, "Quick, close the gate." So he goes and closes the gate. And this is an incredible happening in their life, to have a horse like this. And the neighbor comes by and says, "Such good luck, such good fortune." And the old man says, "Maybe yes, maybe no, only time will tell." A few days go by, and that horse, it leaps over the gate and is gone. His friend comes by and to commiserate and says, "Ah, such bad luck, such bad fortune that this would happen to you." And once again, the old man says, "Maybe yes, maybe no, only time will tell." A few days later, they're in their kitchen. They hear what sounds like thunder. And they look out the window, and that remarkable horse comes riding into the paddock, followed by 20 other horses. The son runs out, closes the gate. The friend comes by and says, "My gosh, such good luck, such good fortune that this would happen to you. You will be a wealthy man." Once again, the old man is circumspect. He says, "Maybe yes, maybe no, only time will tell." The young son decides he wants to learn how to ride one of these horses, and of course they're wild, so he has to break the horse, and he is thrown, and it shatters his leg. And of course they didn't have the modern science, but the healer comes, and he's able to put a splint on the leg, and he says, "With time, I think you'll be able to walk again, but probably with a limp." And the friend comes by and says, "Ah, such bad luck, such bad fortune." And once again, the old man says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." A few days later, the army comes in and they conscript every young man in the village. None of those young men ever return, except, of course, the son who was laid up. He doesn't go to war. So as the story goes, we never know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing because the story is never finished. So that's the first story. And I don't know what your format. Do you interact with the audience, or we interact?
We interact.
Yeah, okay,
yeah.
we interact. So I guess the question is, when you hear that story, where does it take you, especially vis-a-vis the Talmudic kind of commandment to embrace the bad?
So I'll jump in. I grew up with that story, but I always grew up with it as a Jewish story, and the main character was named Shlomi, because Reb Zalman, I think, took that story and was like, "It's Jewish." And there are slightly different variations, but we used to tell it every year at Passover. My dad, every year at Passover, and it was part of our Seder as a way of thinking about liberation is sometimes about like changing what's actually happening, and often actually just about changing our perspective about it. And it's interesting the way that my dad tells the story. He's like, he doesn't fill in any words for the reaction of the old man. He's just like, So you never really know what he's thinking. And in your telling, it was so interesting for me hearing it, because maybe yes, maybe no, only time will tell, to me felt in some ways like pessimistic. Like you learn from the story, but in some ways it just feels like his own reactivity to the joys and sorrows of life is limited and turned down. And I have the question of, is that Zen, or is that just the kind of numbness that comes from lots of trauma?
Rick, I had my reaction to your story is I kind of sort of like it for a thin segment of the pain of life. Right, so it's almost December, and our kids are going to be trying to get into the colleges of their dreams. Your story is perfect for the kid who doesn't get into the college of their dreams, right? Like, I want to go to this college or that college. They don't get into this college or that college. They've always been dreaming about it. They're heartbroken. They go to a different college. Um, your story is fabulous for saying who knows how life will turn out and who knows what opportunities you'll have. And you didn't go to college A, but you're going to college B. And maybe at college B, you'll meet the love of your life. Maybe at college B, you'll have the professor who's going to inspire you. You'll have some life experience, and it's just going to work out splendidly. So I really like your story for that. But how does your story intersect with news that we just know is bad, like a cancer diagnosis?
Yeah. So Scott and I, we've had a lot of conversations about this question. And this gets into the issue of how we make meaning out of our lives. And there's sort of, I think there are three fundamental ways we make meaning. And one is through coherence. Are things cohering and kind of holding together? Purpose and significance. And I think we grow up with a narrative of how things should be or could be. We look around and we see people have healthy lives, they get old, and then they die, hopefully a happy death. But what happens is that in our lives, cancer comes along, or an event that we didn't fit into the narrative. It derails our narrative. Where a child is born who has a disability of some sort, and suddenly that was not the story that we were expecting to. That wasn't the trip we were expecting to take.
You're in Holland now.
Yeah, that's right. And maybe you're suddenly you've arrived in a new place, and we have to adapt to that new narrative. We have to let go of this old narrative we had as a template for what our life should be, and embrace what is. And I think that's to me that feels like the challenge in life, is to suddenly go, I'm in a new story. And there's the old quote, when one door closes, another opens. What we don't normally hear when we hear that phrase, that quote, is that, but we sometimes look so longingly at the door that closed, we don't see the doors that open. So we become attached to our stories. We become attached to our identity, to our idea of who we should be or could be. And that is, in a sense, a story. And we have to be willing to step into a new story, and it's painful, it's uncomfortable, it's challenging, it's scary. I don't think any of us know anyone who has not faced cancer. It seems in my family, it's in circle. Our daughter's father has gotten a diagnosis of liver cancer, which is, not too many people have come back from liver cancer, and so they've given him a prognosis of maybe a year or 18 months. And so suddenly he and the rest of the family are having to reorganize themselves around a new narrative. So it's painful.
So Rick, what's the story that helps your machatenista, that helps your daughter and son-in-law make sense of, make peace with that new story that just is?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I haven't had this conversation with Freedom, so I don't know how she's. Her name's Freedom. Her father was a freedom fighter against Marcos. He's Filipino. And when she was born, she was given, they said, what do we need most? Freedom. So here's a man who was tortured by Marcos, went through a great deal in his life. And so they're having to come to grips, I think, with that he was not going to be with them. And so she's making a lot of room to be with him. She's flying out to California. She's going to be over there for Thanksgiving, won't be in Atlanta where we are for Thanksgiving. She's aware that she has a short period of time with him, and so she's wanting to invest time with him. So that to me seems to be the real challenge, is that we have, the other thing about this story is that I think we tend to live with conclusions. Stuff happens in our life, good stuff and bad stuff. And I think from Elizabeth, you said this is the second arrow. It's is that there are things that are wounding. And what we do, though, is then we tell a story that continues to wound us. And we amend a conclusion on. Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? That's not in the event. That's in our story we tell about the event. And I think that's what creates suffering. great suffering. Yes, and we know people. I've known people who've had a cancer diagnosis, and they often see it as one of the best things that ever happened in their life because it woke them up to life. They were skating along and they weren't alive. They weren't being aware, and suddenly it woke them up to that. This is none of us get out of this alive. And so what decisions? How are we living today? And it brought them back to be present to what is beautiful in life. So, but I think the stories we tell about bad things are the things that really make us suffer. It's the things that we amend, and that, to me, this story has a conclusion. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. Yeah.
Wes, can I say something? So I want to bring a very personal story here. I met my wife almost 30 years ago. And I met her, I was already a cantor in a synagogue in Buenos Aires, and I met her when she came to the temple to say Kaddish for her dad that had just passed away at 46 of cancer. And so I never met him. And we have a son now named Michael, which is the equivalent for Miguel in Spanish. So his memory lives through, and for generations, hopefully. And but it's always this narrative of how much he missed in life, because 46 is, younger than many of us here, and not you, but you're still a baby. But it's such a painful thing. But then, I perhaps never have met my wife if it wouldn't have been for that. But it's a horrible story to think that I met her because of that. I wish I could have met her somewhere else. But I don't know. It's again, it's a painful thing. And how do you look at the whole story?
Elias, can I ask you a question? Since you're a cantor and since you just shared that story and since you pray to God for the work of your life, do you see God in that crazy story that Miguel died at 46 and therefore Lorena said Kaddish and therefore she met Elias and therefore Mikey, who's named after Miguel, was born? Do you see God in that whole crazy damn story?
Well, if I don't see God, I'll be fired, right? It's very simple. That's what I do every day. I pray to God, 300 times a day. So, yeah, but joke aside, it's hard. It's hard to see God there. Well, why? Why? He was such a nice man and very outgoing and full of life, and his life got truncated. And why? What's the purpose of that?
So, Elias, if you don't see God in that story, then what?
No, I do see God.
Oh, no. So then what principle is at play in that very real story, which really is kind of a modern response to Rick's opening story that Elisa's dad uses in the Seder every year? You never know how it's going to shake out. And if you don't see God in the providential design of that, which I totally get because poor Miguel dies at 46, what principle do you see at play?
Michelle Anden, can you help me here?
Help you answer how you feel about it?
No, please bring something elegant here to get out of the situation.
The lifeline. Yeah.
I don't know. It's a great question, Wes, and I don't know the answer for that. I actually don't have the answer because think about who we are as a people, Israel, the people who struggles with God. So there are so many other things in life that we question every day if that is what God wants or God's mandate, or I don't know how to answer to that.
I want to just jump in quickly also. It seems to be two different parts of the story. One is the individual part, Elias meets Lorena. But then also the trajectory, as you just said, of the Jewish people. So we can say, the 46 war was, Gamzul Bracha, right? The the Sinai campaign, the 67 war. That maybe, that became a blessing because, but then it led to a certain period of time where things were great, and now now in Israel, things are a little bit more complex, right? The trajectory of the people. And then we also thinking about our trajectory in the Torah, we have the story of the 400 years of slavery. Now, every one of those individuals that was born a slave and died a slave for 40 generations, how was that gamzel bracha for them, for that individual person? But then we could say, well, but it was a bracha for the Jewish people. So I think we have these two parallel and oftentimes disconnected events happening.
And I'll follow that up by saying we had Tal Becker here. He came to give a Hartman lecture on Thursday night. And one of the most extraordinary things that he spoke about was the idea of changing up the glasses with which you look at the world, right? You have one set of glasses and they cause you to see in this direction. But the truth is that the world is kind of a glasses shop. You get to go and pick which ones you use. And to me, the power of that story is not that it changes anything about the reality, right? The reality is a reality. It's tragic and it's painful, but it can perhaps change the glasses with which we look at it and can help shape our response to the world. So for me, I would prefer to see God in that story.
Just building on Michelle's preferring to see God in that story, could you take us through the leaf, Rick? Because the leaf feels like a Hasidic statement of seeing God in where that little leaf flows. And I'm wondering if anybody can actually believe that.
So this story is a simple little story. The Baal Shem Tov is traveling one day with his disciples, and he is teaching essentially that God is in everything. God has his or her hand controlling and ordering every little detail of the world. And they stop and they're having lunch under a tree, and a small leaf comes fluttering down from the tree and is being blown by the wind and lands in front of them. And one of his students says, I understand that idea of it, but even that little leaf that's being blown about by the wind, and doesn't he have more important things to be worrying about where that leaf ends up here in the field? And the Baal Shem Tov says, no. He says, everything in this field has been ordered precisely to meet the needs of every being in this field. And this is a little perplexing. He says, even the leaf, he says, watch. And they're there watching the leaf, and after a few moments, a worm comes out of the ground and begins to chomp on the leaf. And the Baal Shem Tov says, if God is caring for even the smallest being here in the field, certainly he is caring for all of our needs as human beings. Yeah.
So can I just jump in on that one? How does that story square with the actual world that we live in, like Ukraine? Like, that story would suggest that God cares about the worm. So I would say to God, what about the Ukrainians?
As I think, as I said to Steve when I said when we were starting to think about, I wasn't going to come here this morning because I said it's too much, and it was a little intimidating to come hang out with a bunch of rabbis. I thought, I don't know. But I said this story I built into it's the screenplay that the one man performance tonight's based on, and it's not in the one man performance. But as I was kind of getting ready, I was visiting this story again, and I was having difficulty with this story. It was God in your father-in-law's death so that you can meet your wife. Was everything completely ordered in that way? Yeah.
So could you offer so the literal read is so problematic, obviously.
Yeah.
Could you offer us a non-literal, non-fundamentalist, more metaphorical read that could save that story?
Well, if we think of ourselves as the leaf, perhaps, maybe if we do a little gestalt on this this story. So if I am the leaf, and our life, my life gets blown around, and things happen, and there's many things that feel like they're out of control for me. where I end up, circumstances that are out of my control seem to be affecting so many things that occur. But I think that's also perhaps a story. That's also a lens through which I'm seeing things, an interpretation. But if I can be the leaf and realize that I'm maybe exactly where I need to be right now, I don't know why I'm here, but here I am. And what is for me to discover?
Yeah, for one of my favorite books of all time, As a Driven Leaf, it feels to me as a meditation on this story that Milton Steinberg really grapples with. What do I do in a world where the reality shows me that it is dark and bleak and perhaps God doesn't care at all? And yet, how can I access the possibility that my life may have particular meaning, that where I am and how I am at any given moment may actually be cosmically important? And, I'm not sure that Milton Steinberg really resolves it in the end of his book. Perhaps yes, perhaps no. We could have a conversation about that. But for me, I feel like this story is such a powerful counter narrative to our tendency to see only the suffering of our world. And in some sense, what this story does is it invites us to come into that space and imagine a world where God actually is present in ways that we don't always know.
There's also, for me, a really interesting role of the Besht and his student here, in that they're, in some ways, in that paradigm, they're Ki'ilu God, watching the leaf fall and watching this happen. And it's an interesting space, like one of the moments in chaplaincy training, we talked about God as the presence that feels our pain and is with us in that pain. Maybe can't change it, but it just feels it deeply. And it's interesting, like the watching the leaves fall, they're not like rushing. They know they can't fix those leaves falling, and they know and it's a really interesting moment of what do we do? I mean, what are we doing while we're watching Ukraine? How do we experience things that are happening that we have no control over? And is it possible to just have that sense of hope that, this is going to fertilize something?
Right. There's also a very painful piece of this, which is that God may care for the leaf, but the leaf is going to get eaten, right? There's a sense in which, just because there is love and care and attention does not mean that the life works out how one, if you were the leaf, would want it to work out.
Rick, to me, this story really gets at Zen in a deep way. Because if you look outside the window, right, you see a bunch of withered leaves that are soon to fall, and you see some green leaves outside our window that are soon to become brown leaves that will soon fall. So I think in a deep way, this story is about mortality, right? Because if you look at these outside our window, leaves falling are about literal death, right? This used to be a bud, used to be a shoot, used to be a green leaf, once had a July, once had an August, once had a summer, and now it's tending towards December. Death. And then the regeneration, because it becomes food for the worm. And I think this story is ultimately about, can we be deeply Zen about our own mortality? And how do we, and what lenses, what glasses do we have to get that would allow us to look foursquare and soberly at the fact of our mortality, at our parents' mortality, at the mortality of those that we love, and somehow be deeply Zen with it?
So there's one piece with this that it has to do with the way we're wired. And most of us think that our reality is perceptual, but I think it's interpretive. We're constantly interpreting whether something's meaningful or not meaningful, and we have lenses and filters through which we process all of that. At any one moment, there's like 40 million data points of things I could attend to, and I can't process all that. My brain's not capable of that. I can do maybe 180 or something a second. So I have to make choices. So there are things I attend to, and a lot of things I just completely don't attend to. I think the challenge with wars around the world is that before news, we didn't have to cope with the fact that all these terrible things are happening and that we can, in real time, experience them. And I think that we're not wired to actually cope with that. I don't think that we can cope with that level of tragedy. But I think that also, if I'm the leaf, then I have a story about myself is that I'm somehow separate from the tree and separate from the ground, and that I live in a solipsistic kind of little world where, in fact, I'm deeply interconnected with everything. And so I think that, especially in the West, we have a story around identity which is separate from the world. Whereas in the East, I think there's a much deeper sense of the integral kind of interconnectedness that we have with everything. And so dying is no longer something that's to be worried about or is feared as much, because I'm just part of this process. Whereas we tend to have a sense of this sort of solipsistic contained identity, and I think that's maybe just our story that we once again have created about ourselves, which may be a false story that creates pain.
What is solipsistic?
Disconnected, that we are somehow contained, and that we have no connection with all the other people, with all the other world, with all the other systems around us, is that we are somehow a self-contained unit. Whereas I don't think that's the reality. The reality is that we're deeply interconnected in ways we don't even understand.
Rick, you talk about interpretive. Could you pivot to the third and final story, which is trusting in God's goodness, and that even the very title suggests an interpretive move?
Yeah. So in this story, Reb Nachman and Reb Yaakov are traveling to Mezhebush to be with the Baal Shem Tov for Shabbos. And they're on the road in their carriage, and they come upon another carriage in front of them that's moving very slowly. It has a problem with one of its wheels, and they recognize that there's a government official in that carriage. And they're loath to try to pass the carriage. They don't want to create any problems. But he's going very slowly, and Reb Yaakov is getting a little anxious and nervous. He says, "Oi, oi, oi, we're not going to make it there in time for Shabbos. Oi, what's going to happen?" And so now he's really getting upset, and he catches himself at some point. He goes, "Well, maybe this is for the good too. I don't know." But Reb Nachman says, "No, this isn't just for the good for later. This is good now. Wait and see." And sure enough, as they're coming along, the road narrows, and they come to a bridge, and a carriage, a cart is broken down, and there are a bunch of other carts that are waiting for this guy to fix his cart, and it's backed up, and the government official gets out, and 1, 2, 3, he makes them move the cart, and they take all the milk cartons out, and all the traffic starts flowing, and they get across the bridge, and they come to a fork in the road soon after that, and the official goes off to the right, and they're going to the left to Mezhebush. And Reb Yaakov says, "Oh, maybe this was for the good. If the man hadn't been there, the official, we'd still be there stuck at the bridge." And they get with to Baal Shem Tov, and they tell the story, and he says, "Listen, there are different levels in which we can trust divine providence. So there's the one level where we can see something bad that might turn to good. Okay. But in the case of Reb Nachman, he saw that it was actually good that they were stuck behind this man. And so what the Baal Shem Tov would say is, there is nothing bad, there is nothing evil, it is all good. And can we trust God at that level, that it is all good, which is, I think, the reading from the Talmud.
Yeah. So thank you, first of all. You're a master Maggid. Do you believe in that story?
I would say probably not. I would say I have difficulty with that story. Yeah.
So
So, I mean, that story feels very challenging for me. But I'm now, since coming here, I've been living with that and really kind of reassessing. So, our son, is it okay to share this, Elizabeth? Yeah. 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 So our son they just bought a new house, and they needed some help moving some last things out of their condo to the house, and he asked for Elizabeth if she would help Freedom, and I said, well, I can come along, and turned out he was there, but he had his hand all wrapped up in a bandage, and it turned out he had had a mole taken off of 10 days ago or something, and they found out Monday the diagnosis came back. And it's melanoma. Okay, and so Elizabeth, this is hopefully they took a big chunk out of his hand, and hopefully they got it all. But it's a scary thing. And is this good? And I've been more the old Chinese man. So is this good? Is it bad? I've been a little trying to be just present with what is. But I think when Elizabeth saw the advertisement for today, it really hit her. Is that just what can we embrace that this melanoma is a good thing? And that's I don't know. That's a lot to deal with. I don't know. I can see that it can be for the good because it's been a wake-up call for him in many ways. But is it in itself a good thing? Yeah.
Can I jump in for a second? I mean, this whole thing is really. I can't believe Rabbi Nachman. I find that that's also, and even the Best. I mean, I can't believe that that's the way that a human being can look at the world. I mean, how can we look at the world and not recognize that there's evil? We started the class today with the Talmud about blessing on the evil, with the recognition of that. So it just seems to me almost impossible for a human being to react the way Rabbi Nachman does, and the way that the Besh does, and how do you see the world having no good or evil? I think it just that doesn't work for me. That's for sure.
What's so powerful about the last line here is the last line says, and then they realized this was the exalted level in faith of their holy master, right? Like, not everybody actually can attain that, or maybe even should attain that, but that there need to be people in this world who can look at the world, change their glasses, and say, what do I see here? What can I redeem in this situation? Because that is, in a sense, it's aspirational for the rest of us when we get stuck. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah. Rick, can I ask you the degree of difficulty of what you're presenting to us? Namely, to take the Talmud's dictum seriously and to try to bless God for the bad as well as for the good. That's just so super challenging. And I'm so curious to get to talk to the chef in the kitchen while chopping up the onion. What was your thinking in terms of presenting us with these stories that are so challenging that even you at a certain level have a challenge believing them? I'd love to know why share stories that you yourself struggle with.
Well, I was looking for some answers, so I was hoping maybe you guys could help me. But I feel like this is the crux of faith right here. I think we're sitting right at the knife's edge about what faith is about. And these stories have, just in preparing to come here this weekend, they've stirred up something in me. And I feel like I'm being called to something I'm not sure of yet. And so when I was talking with Steve, I said, I don't think I want to come. But I said, if I did come, there's these stories that have been perplexing to me. And so as we began talking about it, it became like, well, maybe this would be something to share. So I feel like this is my work to work with, and so it's interesting to do a thought experiment. What would it be like to take the next week and live as though everything that is bad is good? Everything that is evil is to be blessed. It would be an interesting behavioral experiment to try it on and see what shifts. Because I'm aware it's very easy to catastrophize life. There's so much to look at and to feel. Really, you can get down very quickly. I mean, it just can be, the weight of it can be, and it feels like that's not the way to live. And is there a different way of being with it? And the story and the commentary of this story is that the Besh says is that by embracing everything that looks bad as good, it actually brings the good more quickly into the world in a way. It shifts something energetically. And so I think that's our challenge, and that feels like that's my challenge.
Rick, thank you. Elias, you got a song for us, and then we're going to pivot to the congregational conversation.
Yes, so it's a Hasidic nigun, since we have so many Hasidic stories here. Ya-da-dai-dai-dai-dai-dai. Ya-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai. Ya-da-dai-dai-dai-dai-dai. Colleagues. Ya-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai. Ya-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai. Ya-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai. Ya-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai. Ya-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai-da-dai.
Thank you, Elias. So our live stream now is gonna conclude, and now Rick, you've got about 20 minutes with our learners here to just be engaged in direct dialogue with our class.
Super. Okay,
So-
thank you.
Thank.
So you're leaving me here all alone?
No,
with
I'll be.
them? Me? Okay, yeah.